A racist cop pulls over a black man, smirks, and slaps the cuffs on, mocking him, calling him just another thug. But seconds later, reality slaps back, because this nobody is actually his new police chief. The moment the truth hits, the entire department is left in complete shock, while the officer's career crumbles before his eyes. You won't believe what happens next. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the city, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was thick, humid, the kind of heat that made tempers short and patience thinner. Officer Brad Whitman sat slouched in his patrol car, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel, his sunglasses perched low on his nose. Another long, uneventful shift. His coffee had gone cold, and the only action he'd seen all day was a minor fender bender between two nervous teenagers. Then, he saw it. A sleek black Escalade, gleaming under the sun, moving smoothly down the boulevard. The man behind the wheel, black, well-dressed, expensive watch catching the light, looked too confident for Brad's liking. Brad's jaw tightened. He didn't need a reason. He never did. With one flick of his wrist, the sirens blared, and the chase was on. Inside the Escalade, Darius Mitchell remained calm as the flashing lights filled his rearview mirror. He had been here before, not in cuffs, but in moments just like this, where being a black man behind the wheel of a nice car meant being a suspect first and a person second. He exhaled slowly, pulling to the side of the road. His heartbeat was steady. The door slammed behind him as Brad Whitman approached, his boots crunching against the pavement. His hand rested too comfortably on his holster. License and registration. The words weren't a request. They were a challenge. Darius reached slowly for his glove compartment, making sure his movements were clear, deliberate. He had learned long ago that anything less could be misinterpreted, and misinterpretation could be fatal. Brad barely glanced at the documents before flicking them back into the car. His lips curled into a smirk. "Step out of the vehicle." Darius hesitated. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" Brad's smirk widened. Suspicious behavior. There it was. Darius swallowed the frustration rising in his throat. He had spent his entire life preparing for moments like these. He had given lectures on police reform, trained officers on bias, fought for justice in communities that had seen too little of it. And yet, here he was. His pulse remained steady as he stepped out of the car, standing tall. But Brad hated that. He wanted compliance, submission, fear. "Turn around, hands on the car." Darius clenched his jaw, but he did as he was told. Metal tightened around his wrists, cold and unforgiving. Click, click. The handcuffs locked in place. Darius had spent his life ensuring that men like Brad answered for their actions. But today Brad would answer for his. Because in just a few minutes, the officer who thought he was untouchable was about to realize he had made the worst mistake of his life. The cuffs dug into Darius Mitchell's wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. But the sting wasn't what bothered him. It was the familiarity of it. He had spent years fighting against this kind of injustice, working to change a system that had been built to break men like him. Yet here he was, another black man in cuffs for no reason. Officer Brad Whitman stood behind him, adjusting his grip like he was restraining a dangerous criminal. His arrogance was suffocating, thick in the air like the heat pressing down on them. "Thought you were slick, huh?" Brad sneered. "Driving a car like that. Acting like you belong here." Darius exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to remain still. He could feel the weight of bystanders watching, their silence louder than sirens. Brad loved this part, the moment where they realized they were powerless. "Where'd you steal this car from?" Brad continued, tightening his grip. Darius let out a short, humorless laugh. He turned his head slightly, looking Brad directly in the eye. No fear, no submission, just certainty. "You have no idea what you've just done." Brad's smirk faltered for half a second before he hardened his expression. "Yeah? And what exactly did I do?" Darius lifted his chin slightly. His voice was calm even. "You just arrested your new police chief." The world seemed to stop. A ripple of tension cut through the air, so sharp it could be felt. For the first time, Brad hesitated. The words hung there, too big to ignore. The smirk was gone. His grip loosened slightly, uncertainty creeping into his posture. "You're lying," Brad scoffed. But there was something different in his voice now. A crack in his confidence. Darius didn't move, didn't flinch. "Check my wallet." Brad hesitated again, his fingers twitching. He could feel eyes on him now, from the bystanders, from other officers who had started to gather. Every instinct in him screamed to keep control, to stay in charge. But something about the way this man spoke, the calm, the authority in his voice, made Brad feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. Sergeant Williams, a senior officer, had just pulled up to the scene. He had caught the tail end of the exchange, but the second he saw Darius Mitchell in cuffs, his heart dropped. He hurried over. "What the hell is going on here?" Brad scoffed, his confidence returning. "Caught this guy driving suspiciously. I was just—" "Take, office, the cuffs." Williams's voice cut through the air, sharp and unmistakably urgent. Brad's stomach dropped. Williams's eyes darted to Darius, and suddenly, everything made sense. The way the man carried himself, the lack of fear, the complete control of the situation even while handcuffed. This wasn't just anyone. This was Chief Darius Mitchell. Williams took a step closer, his voice now borderline panicked. "Officer Whitman, take those cuffs off. Now." Brad still wasn't fully processing. "Wait, Williams didn't wait. He grabbed the keys off Brad's belt, hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs himself. Darius slowly rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Brad's. And now, for the first time, Brad was the one who looked afraid. Because he knew. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. The station was silent. Not the usual quiet hum of officers working at their desks, nor the lull between radio calls. This was a different kind of silence. A thick, suffocating quiet, one that came from shock, fear, and the weight of irreversible mistakes. Inside the precinct, every officer had heard what happened. Their new police chief had been handcuffed and humiliated by one of their own. And now, he was here. Darius Mitchell stepped through the front doors, his presence alone enough to send a ripple of unease through the building. The officers who had been laughing and chatting just moments ago froze mid-sentence. Some stood at attention out of habit. Others avoided his gaze, suddenly busy with their paperwork. And then there was Officer Brad Whitman. He sat stiffly in a chair near the captain's office, his hands clenched into fists. His usual cocky confidence had vanished. His face was pale, his mind racing. Every breath he took felt heavier. His career was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Captain Turner, a man who had spent decades in law enforcement, stood outside his office, watching the chief approach. He already knew this day would be a reckoning. Darius stopped in front of the room, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Inside. Now." Turner nodded quickly, stepping aside. Darius entered first, his steps measured, controlled. Brad hesitated before following, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt this way before, not in a uniform, not in his own precinct. The door slammed shut behind them. Turner leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. He let out a slow breath before speaking. "Chief, Darius held up a hand. "Number you, listen first." Turner fell silent. Darius turned to Brad, his gaze piercing. "Sit." Brad hesitated, then sank into the chair, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. Darius folded his arms, staring at the man who had just abused his power without a second thought. "You pulled me over because I'm black. It wasn't a question." Brad opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was always quick with excuses, always had something to say. But right now, he had nothing. "You humiliated me in public," Darius continued, his voice low but steady. "You put your hands on me. You treated me like I was beneath you, like I was just another thug to be dealt with." Brad swallowed hard. I didn't know." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Darius cut him off. His voice was calm, controlled, but sharp enough to wound. "You didn't know. You didn't care to know. Because to you I wasn't a person. I was just a black man in a nice car." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Brad wanted to defend himself, to say something, anything that could undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it. "You've been on this force for years," Darius continued, "and I guarantee this isn't the first time you've abused your badge like this." Brad's face burned, but he said nothing. Darius leaned forward slightly. "How many times have you done this to a black man who didn't have my title? To someone who couldn't fight back? To someone who had no power?" Brad's breath shuddered, because the answer was too many. And Darius knew it. Turner finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "Chief, what do you want to do?" The room was suffocating. Every fiber of Brad's being screamed at him to beg, to plead, to try and save himself. But deep down, he already knew the answer. "Effective immediately," Darius said, his voice steady, final. "Officer Brad Whitman is suspended without pay, pending a full investigation." Brad's stomach dropped. Turner exhaled, nodding. "Understood." Darius turned to Brad, his expression unreadable. "Hand over your badge and gun." Brad sat frozen. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one who gave orders, the one who controlled other people's fates. Now he was just another disgraced officer being shown the door. His fingers trembled as he unclipped his badge, setting it on the desk. It felt heavier than it ever had before. Then came his gun. When he placed it next to the badge, it felt final. Darius straightened. "You're dismissed." Brad pushed himself up slowly, his legs weak. He felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on his shoulders. He moved toward the door, his mind spinning. But before he could step out, Darius spoke once more. "And Brad." Brad turned, his pulse hammering in his ears. "This is just the beginning." The words followed him out the door like a shadow, clinging to him as he stepped into the precinct, where every single officer had stopped to watch his downfall. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stared, their expressions unreadable. Brad kept walking. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless, and it terrified him. The video was everywhere. A bystander had recorded the entire thing, the moment Officer Brad Whitman slapped the cuffs on his own police chief, mocked him, humiliated him. And then, the moment he realized who he had just arrested. The video spread across social media like wildfire. It was played on every news station, shared on every platform, and the world was furious. If this happens to a black man who's the police chief, imagine what happens to regular people. This isn't just about one bad cop. This is the system. He needs to be fired, not suspended. No more second chances. Outside the precinct, protesters gathered. Their voices rose in chants. No more racist cops. Who polices the police? Justice for all, not just the powerful. Signs waved in the air, painted in bold red and black. Inside the station, officers were uneasy. Some shifted uncomfortably at their desks, knowing they had ignored this kind of behavior for years. Others whispered about whether Brad deserved it, but no one said it out loud. Because now, the world was watching. The briefing room was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters clutched their microphones, waiting. At the front of the room, Chief Darius Mitchell stood tall. He was calm, collected. but his presence alone carried the weight of generations of injustice. He stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. He took a slow breath, his voice steady as he spoke. What happened to me is what happens to black men and women every day in this country. The difference? This time it happened to the chief of police. The murmurs began, quiet but unmistakable. This was not an accident. This was not one bad officer. This was a failure of an entire system, a culture that allows officers like Brad Whitman to act without fear of consequences. That ends now. A reporter raised his hand. Chief Mitchell, do you believe Officer Whitman should be fired? Darius didn't hesitate. Yes. A ripple went through the crowd. But firing one officer isn't enough. I am ordering a full review of this department. Every officer's record, every misconduct complaint, every abuse of power that was swept under the rug. This department will no longer be a place where men like Brad Whitman thrive. The cameras flashed again, journalists scribbling furiously. Under my leadership, we will serve this community with dignity and respect. And if there are officers who can't meet that standard, they will not wear this badge. The statement was final. There would be no negotiations, no second chances for those who abused their power. Darius stepped back, done speaking. The questions flew, reporters shouting over one another. But he didn't need to say anything else. He had made his message clear. That night, Brad Whitman sat alone in his apartment, staring at the TV. His own face was on the screen. The video of the arrest played again, and again. Every time he heard his own voice sneering. Thought you were slick, huh? His stomach twisted. His phone buzzed with messages, but he didn't check them. He already knew what they would say. His friends on the force had turned their backs. His family wasn't answering his calls. His career was over. The mayor had personally called for his termination. By the end of the week, he would be officially fired, not suspended, not reassigned, gone. For years he had abused his power, believing he was untouchable. Now, he had lost everything, and no one was coming to save him. Days passed. The protests slowly faded, but the impact remained. Inside the station, change had already begun. Darius sat in his office, a stack of old misconduct reports in front of him. Cases that had been ignored, complaints that had been buried. No more. He called in Captain Turner. The man looked exhausted but humbled. "We're cleaning house," Darius said simply. "Starting now." Turner nodded. "Where do we begin?" Darius picked up the first file, with the ones who think they'll never be caught. And with that, the real work began. Because justice wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. The city was still talking. Even after the protest died down, even after the news cycle moved on, the impact remained. People weren't just watching, they were waiting to see if real change would happen. If the firing of Brad Whitman was just another symbolic sacrifice, or if the system that protected men like him was actually being torn down. Chief Darius Mitchell knew that, and he was ready. He sat in his office, the morning light filtering through the blinds. Before him was a towering stack of case files, complaints against officers, internal investigations that had been ignored, misconduct reports that had been buried. For too long, this department had been a shield for corruption. That ended today. A knock at the door. Captain Turner stepped inside, his face lined with unease but something else too. Determination. "We've started the internal audit," he said. "You were right. There's a lot here." Darius nodded. "I know." He tapped the files. "This department isn't broken. It was built this way. Our job is to tear it down and build something better." Turner exhaled. "Not everyone's going to like this." Darius looked him dead in the eye. "I don't care." Silence settled between them. Then, slowly, Turner nodded. "Where do we start?" Darius picked up the first file. "With the ones who think they'll never be caught." For the first time in years, people in the community felt something they had long lost. Hope. The black-owned barbershops, The neighborhood diners, the Sunday church gatherings, all of them were buzzing with the same conversation. You hear what the new chief is doing? Man, I ain't never seen a cop hold his own people accountable before. Maybe things are finally changing. Outside the station, Malik, the teenager who had watched Darius's press conference, stood on the sidewalk, waiting. When Darius stepped out of the precinct, Malik called out, "Chief Mitchell!" Darius turned, spotting the young man. He walked over, noticing the hesitation in Malik's stance. "My mom," Malik started, shifting his weight. "She says cops don't care about us, but you're different." Darius studied the boy's face. He saw something there, the quiet, desperate hope of a generation that had never been given a reason to trust the badge. He kneeled slightly, meeting Malik's gaze. "I can't change the past, but I promise you, I'm working to fix the future." Malik's lips twitched into a small, hesitant smile. "Then I guess we'll be watching." And just like that, Darius knew what he was fighting for. That night, in a small apartment on the other side of town, Brad Whitman sat alone. His career was gone. His friends had distanced themselves. His name was a stain on law enforcement. The video of him arresting his own police chief still played on TV screens across the country. The moment of his downfall was immortalized forever. He reached for his phone, staring at the contacts list. The people he had once commanded, laughed with, abused his power beside, none of them were answering now. For years he had worn his badge like a shield of invincibility. But now he was just a disgraced man in an empty room. And he knew this was what true consequences felt like. The next morning, Darius Mitchell stood in front of a room full of officers. Some were old faces, men who had been part of the problem but now had to decide. Would they change, or would they go? Others were new recruits, young officers who wanted to do the job right. Darius scanned the room, and then he spoke. "This badge is not a weapon. It is a responsibility." The room was silent. "If you are here to serve this community, to protect and uplift every single person in this city, then you have a place in this department." A beat of quiet tension. "But if you believe you are above the people you swore to protect, leave now." No one moved, but they all felt the weight of his words. Darius took a slow breath. "Today, we start over." And with that, the department that had once protected men like Brad Whitman began its transformation, not with words, not with promises, with action. Because justice wasn't just a moment, it was a movement.